And now we start here on Daf Mem Tes Amid Beis. The Gemara answers, what do we need this pasuk? Al kol nafshos meislo yavo in the parish of Kohen Gadol, according to Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara answers, Al kol lafuke rechokim. That when the Torah says that a Kohen Gadol is enjoined from being metame himself, al kol nefashos, the al kol is coming to include rechokim. And without the pasuk, then we might think that in the case of rechokim, since he's not in such a state of tsar, it's not antithetical to his kedushas kahuna. Now, it says al kol mes. Why did the Torah have to add the word mes? That's superfluous. Lafuke krovim. You might have thought that since the Torah in the case of Kohen Hedjot was matir tuma for the sake of bearing the krovim, it might apply as well to a Kohen Gadol. And therefore the Torah had to mention mes as an extra word to include krovim. Then it says I'll call mes. It says I'll call nafshos mes. What's the nafshos? Lafuke revius dam sheyotza mishnei mason. And this is coming to tell us that even though we spoke about a chatzi lug dam as the minimum share of dam, but what happens if we can get a revius dam that comes from two different mason? Would that also be asur in the isur of tumas Kohen Gadol? And that means that if, let's say, you have a revius dam sheyotza mishnei mesim, whether or not that would be mitami b'yoel. And from the pasuk of nefashos, we're going to derive the conclusion that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to be mitame to a revius dam sheyotza mishnei mesim. And that's the plural of the word nefashos. Nefashos means two different nefashos, two different mason. Now he points out here, number one, that the Mishnah says that Nazir megalech al chatzi log, which is two revios. But now we're darshaning nafshos meis, shtei nefashos. Shir echad shel revius dam, shehu agorin misa, she'ein odem yochel lichios b'pachos mikach. So the minimum amount of blood that you need to survive and to send oxygen around the body is a revius dam. And now ba mishtei nefashos. All right. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Mem Tes Amid Beis. Al Elu, until now we've been listing the Isur Tumas Mes of a Nazir, and now the Mishnah wants to get into detail to tell us which Tumas Mes is included under the Isur of Tumas Nazir. Al Elu Tumas HaNazir Megalech. And it means that if a Nazir contracts Tumah in any of the following ways that are enumerated here in the Mishnah, then he's going to be Matayr himself, and then he's going to undergo Giluach and bring his Karbanos of a Nazir, Tomei, and then he starts his Nazirus again. Alames, and we'll have a long discussion about why the Mishnah had to mention mes, when afterwards it says Ve'al Kizayis min mes. So if mes means a mes sholem, the complete corpse, the complete body. Why was it necessary to tell you such a thing? We could derive it from a kal v'chomer, from kizayis min mes. So that's going to come later on. Let's just take a moment's time to go through the parsha of Nazir in Naso Bamidbar Vav, V'chiyamus meis olav v'pesa pisom, v'tomei rosh nizro v'gilach rosho b'yom ta'aras v'yom hashvi galchen. So if a Nazir contracts tumas mes, then we wait the 7 days. We need hazov mechatos on the 3rd and the 7th days, and then he becomes tar on the 7th day with tvila b'mikvah. Then he's megalech sarah. On the very next day, Yom Hashmini, he brings his karbanos of a Nazir Tameh, which is Shnei Torim or Shnei Bnei Yonah, Echad Li'olav, Echad L'chatos. And then he begins to count his Nazirus from scratch. All the days that he counted of Nazirus, Kima Nazirus Noflim, they completely wiped off the face. And there is Tumos Minames that im Hanozir Nitma Mehem, Einu Megalech Aleim, Ve'einu Mevi Karbanos Yom Terasa, Ve'einu Sosis Yimei HaKodmin. Mipnei Shelo Nemar Ben Nazir Ki Yitma L'Nefesh, Elav Chiyamus Olav Mes. V'lomdu mikan shetzarach sheyitma hanazir mitumos shehein me'atzmo shel mes. So that's called atzmo shel mes. So there are tumas which are considered outside the purview and not to be categorized as atzmo shel mes, and if ein nazir megalech aleim, he doesn't bring his karbanos. He simply needs shivas yamim, and after the mechatos of hazah yom shlish yom shvi, then he becomes tar, and he continues his nazirus as if nothing happened. But here he writes the osam yemei tuma, but during those 7 days of tuma, even though there's no steer of his Nazirus in these cases, nevertheless, he cannot incorporate those 7 days of Tumah into his Malos of Nazirus. Now, this Mishnah here that we're about to study now is going to enumerate the Tumos Shanozim Megalech Alem. As we said before, there are Tumos She'ena Nozim Megalech Alem because they're not considered Atzmo Shel Mes. Okay, fine. V'al-kizayis netzel. What is netzel? So he says, based on the Rambam, that netzel is basar hamesh sheni moach. I guess after the body disintegrates and the moisture of the flesh of the body is separated from the rest of the flesh. So the flesh itself becomes very dry, which is going to be rakov. We'll get to that later on. But the moisture itself is called lecha in modern Hebrew. And the lecha that comes out of the basar as the flesh after it disintegrates, that lecha is called netzel. And if you have a full kizayis worth of that lecha, then it's metame and nazir is megalechol. Then we have below tarvad rakov. Okay, now rakov is already something else. It's the dry part that was left after disintegration. And tarvad is a kaf. A kaf is like a spoon, and a tarvad is a certain volume. So if you have a malot tarvad of rakov, of rekev, of afar, it's really like dust. Now, I was wondering what would be the status of somebody who was cremated. What happens with that ashes? I don't know if it has the status of rakov. I don't know. But when the natural process of disintegration takes place, and all the moisture of the body is removed, and the body, therefore, what's left is dried up, it becomes like offer. It's like the dust on the earth. And if you have a Malo Tarvan Rekev, then Nazir Megalechol. But here, I'm looking for the note, which I'm not finding right this second. The status of Malo Tarvan Rekev is different than everything else on this list. Because I think it's only Mitame Bimagu Masa, not Biol. But okay, I'm not finding that now. One second. Oh, I think I know where it's going to be. It's going to come up later on the Mishnah. Yeah, here it is. Malo Tarvad Rekev is different than everything else on this list. Because I made a mistake. I said there's no Tumas. What I meant to say was there's no Tumas Maga. The reason why there's no Tumas Maga in the case of Rekev is because Rekev is like offer. And every part of the offer is like a separate entity. So it's only when he carries the whole Mali Tarvad, that's called Masa, or he enters into the Oel, and there was a Malotam, then it's Metame, but not Bimag. So that's going to be, let me just make a note of it, footnote Yud Tes over here. Which we'll get to a little bit later on. Okay. All right. Now, Al Hashidra. Okay, the Shidra is the spinal column, Val Glugoles, and the skull. Now, do we need both of those together, or are these two separate entities? But the Chiddush, no matter which way we go, is that there's no basar at all. Nothing left to the flesh. Oh, he points out in the footnote that the Gemara is going to vacillate back and forth whether it's Shidra b'fnei atzma and Gilgoles b'fnei atzma or Shneim b'yachad. So that's the sugya that later on at Daf Nun Beis. The al Aver min Ames. Now Aver min Ames or Aver min Achai is only Ksheyesh alav basar karoi. In other words, that there's enough flesh left on the Aver that it could be reattached. I guess you'd call it like a transplant to a live organism, and it would grow. It would come back to life. That's why if Chas V'Shalom somebody has has a part of his body severed, you bring that to the hospital because they can sometimes reattach it. Now the chiddush here in Aver min Ames or Aver min Achai is that it doesn't have a kazayis basa, because earlier we said al kazayis min Ames. But the chiddush here is that even though it doesn't have a kazayis, nevertheless, since it's a full Aver and it's roy to be mechaber it back to an Adam Chai, and it would be regenerated, so to speak, and it would be part of the functioning organism. Therefore, it's metami b'toras Aver. V'al chatzi kav atzomos. So you have broken bone pieces and you gather them together, and it has a chatzi kav. Now this shear, all the shearim, of course, halach l'Moshe Sinai, but this shear of chatzi kav is what's called rov binyono shel mes. In other words, if you would collect together the shivrei atzamos, the broken bones, and gather them together and put them together, you would end up with rov binyono shelmes. That's one possibility. Hainu, he says, Shatzomos shehemi rov govo shelmes. We're not talking about the head, but the most of the body. And that's shnei shukayim v'yerech achas, or shtei rechos v'shok echad, v'nikrim rov binyono, shekol binyono hu shtei shukayim v'yerechayim v'atzlos v'ashidra. Okay, fine. This is called rov binyono shalmes. Now we have something else called rov minyan atzomos, which is 125, because all the atzomos come to 248. So if you have 125, that's already the majority of 248. And chatzi kav me'osan atzomos ma'at b'kol etzem v'etzem Nazir megaleach aleim. Okay, I mean, we're just touching on the surface here. I mean, this is Masechet Olos. Ve'al chatzi log dam. All right, so you have blood that came out, and the volume is chatzi log. And before we had a discussion about revius dam mishnei mesim, if you remember. The afal pisha revius log dam and ames metami bi oel. So here's where we get into this distinction, Rabbi, that we mentioned earlier about atzmo shalmes, where the Nazir is megaleach, and that's derived from the pasuk v'chiyomas olav mes, as opposed to other tumas mes, which is not called atzmo shalmes. And the Nazir is not megaleach aleim. He simply undergoes tara. And that's going to be a discussion later on about revius log dam min ames. That's metame. Let's say, for example, if he comes into an oil and there's a revius dam in the oil, dam min ames in the oil, then he's tameh. But it's not called atzmo shalmes until it's what? Until it's a full chatzi log. And then Nazir megaleach. I'm wondering if this distinction is relevant to other dinim. I think I once learned about that, but I don't remember the specifics. Now, regarding all the above, the Mishnah says, a klal, v'al magor v'al masom v'al ahilam, that the law of Nazir megaleach alav applies whether or not he comes in contact with them, or he carries them even though he doesn't touch them, or he's mile on them, or they were mile on him, or he ends up in the same oil with them. And as we discussed before, with regard to Mekav, there's no tumas maga. Now the Mishnah says, V'al etzem kisaora, and the reason why the Mishnah left etzem kisaora for the last and formulated it after the general klal is because it's only al magov al maso, but there's no tuma of ohel. In the case of a person who went into an oil and there was an etzem kisaora in the oil. The only question I have is, so why is Malo Tarvad Rekev not left for the end of the Mishnah since there's no Tumas Maga? Okay, I don't know. Al Elu an Nazir megaleach. So in all the above, after he finishes his Tara process on the seventh day, so he had the Hazos Meichatos from the Paraduma on Shlishi Ushvi. Now he goes to the mikveh and he's Megalech Esara V'Sosros HaKodmin, and all the previous days that he had observed as a Nazir are completely gone, and he begins a brand new minyan of Naziris. The Eno Maskal Limnos Ella Ad Shitar, he cannot begin his Naziris of Tara until he is Tahar, and then maybe his Kamanosa B'Yom Shmini. Now here we have a Machlokas Tanoim, Shri Rabbi Elazar Chachamim, about whether he can begin counting his Naziris Tara on the seventh day, or does he have to wait till the eighth day when he brings his Karbanos? That's going to be a sugya later on in Daf Nun Dal. The Gemara quotes a brisa. Ton Rabbanan. Achar ptiroso shel Rabbi Meir. This is a little bit of an agadic interlude. Rabbi Meir was very sharp, and he created an atmosphere in his base medrash in which the Talmidim would constantly challenge the Rebbe, and the Rebbe would challenge them. It could be that they didn't even understand Rabbi Meir. He was very deep. And after he died, the question is, where would the Talmidim go? And the, let's say, the counterpart on that level of a Rosh Hashiva would have been Rabbi Yehuda. But Omerlem Rabbi Yehuda, Talmid of Al Yikonsu, Talmid Rabbi Meir, don't let the Talmid of Rabbi Meir join our base medrash. They used to a different style. If they should kanshronim hain, kanshronim means you want to cut somebody down. V'lo lilmod Torah hain boim. In the excitement of challenging one another in the Rebbe, they lose sight of the Limud Torah. They get so involved in this dialectic of Kantronim that they leave the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And if they're going to come into my base medrash, says Rabbi Yehuda, then they're going to be mitzayer me. They're going to try to defeat me in arguments and bring me down. And ba'alachos hein boim, they want to show off that they know the halacha well, and that no one could stand against them and beat them in halacha. And therefore, I don't want them in my base medrash. Now, in the commentaries here that he brings, in the name of the Orchas Tzadikim, it wasn't that Rabbi Yehuda was afraid of all this, counter argument against him, but rather it would cause him levatel migirsoso. It would undermine his ability to spend every last minute of time dedicated to his style of learning. However, Dochak Sumchus, one of the, if not the most outstanding student of Rabbi Meir, somehow pushed his way in, and he went into the base medrash of Rabbi Yehuda. And sure enough, like the style that he was used to as a student of Rabbi Meir, he begins to engage in some sort of debate. So Sumchus says to Rabbi Yehuda, Kach shonali Rabbi Meir. Here's the way I was taught this Mishnah. It seems like all the Tanoim before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi organized the Mishnayos, each Tana had his own, Seder HaMishnayos. And in the Seder HaMishnayos of Rabbi Meir, there was a certain girsa, a certain a text, which Sumchus had. And in his text of the Mishnah that Sumchus, received from his Rebbe, Rabbi Meir, it says, Al elu tumos hanozir megaleach al ames, val kazais min ames. That's exactly as we have it. But Rabbi Yehuda didn't have that Mishnah. Or at least he took out two words from the Mishnah, al ames. Because once you have kazais min ames, it's totally redundant and unnecessary to add mes. Because if a kazais min ames is enough for a Nazir to be Galech, how much more so a full mess? Is cause Rabbi Yehuda. When Rabbi Yehuda heard Sumchus's alteration in the Nusach HaMishnah, and Rabbi Yehuda was convinced that that was a mistake, that reformulation of the Mishnah in which you add the words alames, he got upset. And he started thinking, why did the Talmidim let Rabbi Sumchus come in? And again, Sumchus may have come in, incognito, but Rabbi Yehuda suspected that it was the Talmidim who allowed Sumchus to enter in. And that got him angry, because they should have prevented Sumchus from coming in, because Rabbi Yehuda had already told his Talmidim that after the demise of Rabbi Meir, I don't want the Talmidim of Rabbi Meir to come into my base medrash. They're just going to upset things. When Rabbi Yehuda gets upset, he turns to his Talmidim, he says, Lo kach amarti lechem, didn't you get my message? That al yikonsu Talmidim Rabbi Meir lekan, and they should kantaronim ninu, and Sumchus is trying to get me upset by changing the nusach of the Mishnah. And he adds al mes, which is totally unnecessary to the Mishnah. He's changing the gears of the Mishnah. Because al kazayis min ames megalech al mes lo kolshkein. How much more so? So there was no need for the Mishnah to mention a mes shalem. Here we turn to Daf Nun. Rabbi Yossi. Now, I'm not 100% sure if Rabbi Yossi at this point is a Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda, or he's a Tana, which he certainly is on his own right. But he goes back and forth in his mind as to whether or not he should jump into this discussion and justify the Talmidim of Rabbi Meir, of Sumchus. And he says the following. This is the way he deliberates in his mind. He says, look, if I say nothing, Yomru, the Talmidim, will say Meir Shachav, Rabbi Meir died, Yehuda Kas, and when Sumchus offered an alternative nusach of the Mishnah, Yehuda got angry, and he had a kash on that nusach of Rabbi Meir's Mishnah, where the Mishnah had mess, and that was totally unnecessary. Yossi Shasak, if I'll be quiet, then it will imply that I agree, sort of like Hodas, Shtika Hodadami, that Rabbi Yehuda's objection to Rabbi Meir is correct. But Torah, Matei Aleh. I mean, we've got to have a certain integrity and honesty about Torah. Rabbi Meir said that you have to say the Mishnah Lames. So who's going to explain Rabbi Meir? Well, we're just going to be shosek and say, all right, Rabbi Yehuda got angry. That's it. Let's not upset the apple cart. And therefore, after Rabbi Yossi went back and forth and he came to the conclusion, Torah Mata'eleh, he decided he's going to get up and he's going to officially present and explicitly present his explanation for the girsa of Rabbi Meir. Lo nitzvah ela lemes she'ein alav kizayis basar. Interesting. You could have a mes shalem. It's a complete body, like for example a nefel. And yet, as the nefel sort of never shrinks with the passage of time, you end up without a kizayis. So if you only add kizayis min mes, you wouldn't know mes shalem in a case where there's no kizayis basar. So the Mishnah had to say mes in order to set up a new category called mes that could not be derived with a kal v'chomer from kizayis basar, because we don't have a kizayis basar in this case. All we have is a mes. A mes shalem is a separate category. So I'm going to just go a little bit weiter here, not much, but just to get a for tomorrow. Vadayin Yomar, Rabbi Yehuda could still ask a kasha and say that I don't need the Mishnah to say mes, because I could derive from a different Kal V'chomer. Even if it doesn't have a Kizayis, al Aver Mimena Megaleach, al Kulo L'Kolshkein. We had the case of an Aver, which is listed in the Mishnah, and Noz Megaleach, even though there's no Kizayis Basar. Again, you need a little bit of basar such that it could be regenerated if it's transplanted or reconnected to the body. But nevertheless, it doesn't have a kizayis basar. Is al kula l'kolshken, if you have a full body, a corpse of a mess, how much more so would a nazir have to be megalech of, even though it doesn't have a kizayis basar? And if an aver, one organ, one limb of the body is nazir megalech olav, even though it doesn't have a kizayis basar, then how much more so a full-fledged mess? Ella, now the Gemara, I don't know, this is not Rabbi Yossi, but the Gemara itself jumps into the fray and explains Rabbi Meir Hames. Why does it say Hames? Kidom Rabbi Yochanan. As Rabbi Yochanan said it in explaining a Mishnah in the second parak of Olos, which lists all that which is Metami V'Oel, and it says Hames, and it says Kizayis Min Hames. And once again, we should have the objection of Rabbi Yehuda. Why do you have to mention Mes if you have Kizayis Min Hames? We should derive Mes from a Kal V'chomer. And on that kash on Olos Parak Beis, Rabbi Yochanan offered the following answer: Lo nischacha el nefel, shelo niskashru evara begidin. So we're talking about a nefel at the very beginning of its development, and it still doesn't have what we call a chibur. There's nothing connecting the parts of the body together, the various limbs or the gidim of the body. They're not connected. So this is a very early stage in the development of the fetus. But we have the entire nefel. And the chiddush here, says Rabbi Yochanan of the Mishnah, is that since you have an entire nefel, it's metame v'oel. Even though there's no real let's say Aver Shalom Shal Basar or Gidin or Atzamos, doesn't have a Kizayis Basar. So it could not possibly be Mitame Mishum Aver, not Mishum Kizayis Min Hames. And therefore, none of the Kal V'chomer is neither from Kizayis Basar nor from Aver. None of those would work in this case of Nefel. And therefore, we need a special inclusion that this nefel is metami bi oel, because the mesh sholem hochinami here too will apply the same logic that we're talking about a nefel sholem iskashu evara begid, but it's metami midin mesh sholem. And Rav Amar lo nitzucho, why did the Mishnah have to say al mes el lerov binyano ulerov minyano? Okay, so that's already, I don't know, do we, just 1 second, let's just see, just look at the clock here and see how much time we might have. All right, so maybe we have another 2-3 minutes, and we're talking about Rov Minyano, She'ein Bahem Rova Atzomos. He says here the following: Atzomos shlemos, shehin rov binyan atzomos shel gova adam, or rov minyan atzomos of shel hames, she'ein bahem rova atzomos. Right? We had in our Mishnah a rova kav. Let's go back for a second to Daf Mem Tesom in Beis. And we had here, Chatzi Kav Atzomos. which is equal to Rov Binyono Shel Mes or Rov Binyono Shel Atzomos. And now we're talking about Ein Bahem Rov Atzomos. Just 1 second. Chatzi Kav. Let me just make a calculation here. Chatzi Kav. Where am I? Oh, here it is. This one. Even though, again, Rava would complete the sugya, I think I want to do this with Kovid Rosh. So let's make a note of where we got up to here on Daf Nun Amid Aleph, correct? All right. Very good. Again, these gory halachas, but, the Torah is all inclusive. Okay, have a great day.